Hi everyone, welcome to the Brick and Block podcast. I have a very special guest, very old friend, and who has come about into a very brilliant position. Very, very happy to introduce Bushra Mohamed. Hi, Bushra.
Hi, Pradumn. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much for making the time. It's brilliant to get you on board. What's been amazing for me actually is that since we've known each other since way back at university, you sort of come about into this amazing role right now where you're not only a lecturer, you've got your own practice, but you've also been sort of involved in lots of different and amazing things. So I thought maybe that might be a nice thing to start off with in terms of, because I guess perhaps, I don't know if, and you'll have to correct me, but did you always think that you'd probably be in this position, or did you think that going into university, I'll just, become an architect, but you've actually sort of evolved that into something quite unique for yourself?
Yeah, I definitely didn't foresee where I am now. I think I went into studying architecture, wanting to be an architect and I think this is actually very common, kind of wanting to make a difference through architecture, kind of seeing it as quite a kind of large responsibility to be an architect and then to kind of affect our built environment through that role. And then I guess throughout my journey of being an architect, just like finding a lot of uncertainty and a lot of insecurity, I guess, in the profession and in the journey through the profession. And through that, also kind of discovering my own agency and my own interest in the profession. I think that's really what makes an architect kind of stand out, is the kind of niche that they form for themselves or what it is that they can bring to the profession. Because it is so broad and it is so sprawling. So yeah, I guess through the process of sort of becoming qualified, started to, because it's a long journey, right? Like, it
is massively.
Through that long journey, you're kind of really figuring out what it is that you want to do and how you want to do it. And I found myself in a position where I really enjoyed various elements of the profession and practicing, including teaching, including the research, including writing. So kind of put myself in positions where I could do those things and had to actually fight a little bit to be able to do those things, as well as, of course, building and making ideas kind of come to fruition or become sort of built artifacts in the world. So, that's where I am now, I guess.
You think that we were just talking off air before that the relevant experiences, we worked at the same practice a very long time ago at one point, and do you think small experiences like that through practice and through your time at university doing sort of research and, the simple sort of level that when we were, at education level, doing research about projects, do you think all of that informed perhaps your interest to set up your practice in a way that perhaps, because you mentioned the niche, the niche is very important, and you actually, you even, I think this is one of your recommendations in one of the articles recently, that we as architects, there's so many of us, we do need to find our niche. Do you think all of those elements has led itself to that, or was it a slightly different route maybe that, came about later on?
I think it's for me, I haven't completely dissected and unpicked my journey. So I can't say I can't point to the specific time where I sort of had found my niche. But I do remember that even during my part one for my final dissertation, history and theory dissertation, I wrote a dissertation on the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya and how there were no statues or remembrance elements in Britain about that very sort of violent history that's part of British history, because the army went out, the RAF went out there to kind of, it was a huge kind of state-led resistance to the Mau Mau. And in Kenya, of course, the Mau Mau uprising was a sort of guerrilla freedom fighter uprising that eventually led to Kenyan independence from the British Empire. And I remember, I'm born in Kenya, from Kenya. Both my parents born and bred in Kenya. I moved to the UK. I'm also British. And I always knew that my sort of Kenyan identity, my understanding of the British Empire was important to me. And I knew it had something to do with architecture. Of course, at the time, I didn't do any design projects in relation to this, but I had a kind of yearning to explore it. My dissertation was an opportunity to do that. So I did, and I did the research, and it was first-hand research interviewing my grandmother, who was kind of part of it or had memory of it, and then going to Kenya to understand the impact of the Mau Mau on the built environment there. And then in my part two, again, for my dissertation, it seems to always be through history and theory. But in my part two, also in my dissertation, did a dissertation on the kind of Indian independence architecture on Balkrishna Doshi and the architecture of Ahmedabad. So I sort of feel like there was a thread of interest, but I guess what was the real catalyst is during that process, I never really had anybody who encouraged me to explore that interest, or explore that element of my identity or my own lived experience. And I thought that was odd, right, in my education. And I thought that it was a very narrow way of understanding architecture, always looking at the Grand Tour, Palladio, Italian Renaissance as the way of understanding what the future of architecture should be. So I think that I think at the fundamental level, though, that's why an architectural education is amazing, because it tells you to continually be critical of what it is you're being told and educated on, but also what it is that you're doing. It kind of builds this criticality within you. So I never really let go of this nagging feeling of, this is weird that no one's encouraging me, or there's more information on this out there. Yeah. And that's kind of what led me to what I'm doing now.
Did that also, that critical analysis, I guess, for that love, I guess, probably, which started to, it's a curiosity, isn't it? And that curiosity sort of leads you to something that you perhaps quite enjoy. Would that be the base perhaps for the opportunity to teach? Because obviously you've done that now at a few institutions now. And clearly you enjoy it because you're doing a great job of it. But is that something that did lead you to it, or was that just purely a great opportunity to?
I know. I think that what led me to teaching was, I think I worked really hard, and I think I had a good work ethic. It's so awkward to say that you work hard. I think everybody works hard in architecture school, but I think I worked really hard, particularly in my part two. I was really adamant, because I took 2 years out between my part one and my part two. And in those 2 years, I was really thinking about what is it that I want to do with my architectural degree, and what do I want to do, particularly in these 2 years in my master's, what I want to get out of it. And I understood that what I wanted to get out of it was, I wanted to have a real kind of understanding of how to design what I at the time considered good architecture. And I did really by like cycling around London, trying to understand what it is that I thought was good, and then try to dissect sort of the principles of what that is. And then I chose to go to Kingston School of Art because I thought that the architects who taught there were really good designers. So I really wanted to get that out of it. And during my part 2, I think I really worked on that element, how to understand. And my final year project, my thesis project, got nominated for the silver medal, the RIBA silver medal. My tutors and the professor of architecture at the time, Daniel Rosbottom, I think, sort of understood that I, was trying to tease something out there and recognized. And so when I graduated, there was this kind of, I guess, like connection made between the tutors there and what it is that I was trying to do. So they invited me back. And I think that I took that opportunity to teach because I wanted to keep my foot in researching, in design. And I think that I thought that at the time that teaching would be the way to do that. So I wanted to sort of always, or well, not always, but I wanted to have a connection with that. And I thought at the time that if I was teaching, it would be much easier to keep up with the changes in architecture. So I think once you go into practice, it is kind of a bit easy to get lost in the sort of details of delivering projects, and you sort of stuck in the status quo.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that at times, because I do find that, when you are, I'm working on projects that will take 2 or 3 years to do, so your, concept design, develop design, tender, construction takes a year. And you do often get into that, loop of just, okay, this is my project for the next, 2-3 years. And you might have another one on the side, the hobbies, as we call it in the office. But you do sort of lose touch at times. And it's something that I have found myself, and partly actually this lovely podcast idea is to also stimulate my curiosity by speaking to, people like yourselves and other peers in the industry, the whole built environment industry, to help stimulate that curiosity about, what climate change might be. And I think it's really important that we all do that for ourselves, whatever that subject might be or area. And that's amazing to hear that, actually. I mean, did some of those elements of curiosity lend itself quite naturally to some of your projects that you've been working on, or do you think that's sort of potentially brief based?
No, definitely. The curiosity. I would say since starting the practice, so I guess maybe for context, I've been teaching on and off at Kingston School of Art since 2015, since I graduated. I taught for 4 years between 2019 and 2022 at 23 at the Architectural Association. I was running a diploma unit there. And now I'm kind of, I'm a module lead for history and theory at Kingston School of Art. And for the last 2 years, I've been running my own practice. I've been director of Soma Architects. So running my own practice. And then I would say the projects that I've worked on as Soma Architects have all in some way been driven by my research interests and by kind of curiosity with those interests. So the Archae-Africa Pavilion, the Tropical Modernism exhibition, which actually we were approached specifically because of our interests in studying tropical modernism on the African continent, but specifically in West Africa. The Islands exhibition, also, specifically the design, all of the design, as well as even being approached to do it was, I think, in a lot of ways tied to my approach and my research interest, decolonial sort of pedagogy, were kind of indigenous ways of building, interest in kind of earth architecture. Yeah. And so, back to your point, the curiosity, I think that in a way, it's the only way to challenge the status quo. So this criticality, the only way to challenge the status quo is to be curious and to ask sort of the pertinent questions. Of course, something that I am really aware of, because I think during my education, again, I was always very conscious of being too theoretical. And when I say too theoretical, I really just mean like living in or studying architecture through the lens of theory alone. I really find that I need, as an architect, I need to be able to find a synergy between the theory and the reality, the practicalities, for it to make sense. I think it's really difficult for me to just work within the realm of theory. And every time, a word, like even the term decolonial, which I think is a very theoretical term, or I use the term diasporic to explain, kind of mixed identities that I think is really important to communicate through the built environment. That's, again, a very academic term. So finding ways of very practically and very physically communicate what those terms mean has like been a constant sort of curiosity, but also thing that I've tried to do with the practice.
Yeah, I think it certainly shows with some of the projects that you've worked on. And I think you can often see practices out there that I think it's not so much, I think, about partly identity, but I think it's also quite nice to see that you've got quite a strong ethos, and for me that's quite evident in the work or even just the way that you're talking about your approach to your teaching or even the practice work. And I guess what for me was quite interesting is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but like the point that you mentioned about the Archi Africa Pavilion, you mentioned that earlier on, that there is going to be a reusable element to it. I think that's probably a great way of thinking about circularity in our industry, where I don't know, was that an intention from the get-go that you would do that?
Yes. Yeah, right from the beginning, the intention actually was to bring the pavilion back. So it was designed and built, a self-built pavilion, built in collaboration with students of Kingston School of Art and One-to-One Collective, which were kind of group of architects and designers who set up after studying at Kingston. And the idea was that we would build it in Venice and then we would dismantle and bring it back to Kingston and kind of set it up as a sort of a reading library of sorts at Kingston School of Art. But because of cost issues, but also I think, something that we weren't quite prepared for was that kind of embodied energy of shipping something across, from, kind of Northern Europe to back to the UK. So we decided actually to give it to the Biennale team. So Biennale dismantled, and what they do with all of the pavilions that they kind of take under their wing, because the Biennale this is a kind of thing that we also explored with islands in at the Design Museum, is that exhibitions in general are kind of very temporary. They're temporary elements, first of all, and they are really wasteful inherently. So how do we create a circularity with temporary pavilions and ensure that we're not just creating more and more waste every year with, these amazing ideas that we want to show the world. So the Re-Biennale team kind of took the whole pavilion, and through their recycling of the materials, we were able to use, so it was all made out of Douglas fir, the pavilion, which is a kind of hard wood. So something that would kind of hold its structure and integrity. And they were quite chunky sections, so they were able to reuse them in lots of different pavilions. They reused them for the Chilean pavilion in 2022, and then the German pavilion in 2023. Nice. So it's really nice to kind of see it come back and almost be part of the life of the Biennale since it was installed. At the time when we built the Archi-Africa Pavilion, it was the first pavilion at Venice to sort of represent Africa. And of course, Africa is a continent, so it's a really large place. Ghana had a pavilion, I think in 2019, which was actually part of the Art Biennale, which David Adjei built, and it was curated by Nana Afriata-Chim. And that was a kind of, again, like one of the first times where sub-Saharan African country had representation at the Venice Biennale. And this became like really important to us. It's like, how do we represent the continent at a Biennale that is exclusively European for the most part? Egypt does have a pavilion, but, it's sort of one country in North Africa, so can't represent the whole. Also Egypt, we don't want to really get into it, but of course, like for the most part, Egypt represents the sort of Arab world, rather than the African world, at least the sub-Saharan African world for the most part. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so it was really important to us to have this pavilion that represented like the identity or some of the identities of sub-Saharan Africa, we were working, so it was called the Archi-Africa Pavilion because we were working with an organization, a charitable organization based in Jamestown in Accra called Archi-Africa itself, and they sort of organize events in relation to the built environment of Jamestown and Accra. So there was this kind of like full circle moment of Jamestown, Accra being on the ocean, Venice also being on the sea, and the materials sort of being able to come there through trade by the sea, and also for the material then to go away through the sea. But financially didn't work out to bring the pavilion back. So it was nice that we're able to still keep that circularity intention in the pavilion.
Yeah, I mean, that's really amazing to see. I mean, I've certainly, whenever I've managed to get away from my technical design and construction, I've tried to get to a couple of exhibitions here and there. And I think there's a shift in the industry, I think generally, that we are becoming a little bit more comfortable with reusing things. Mm-hmm. And, we're becoming a little bit more comfortable with seeing something that's a little bit more secondhand, or perhaps has a little bit of more honesty in terms of the materials, or it's a little bit more rawness. Mm. I think that's quite nice. Because I think often as designers, we often get drawn into, this material needs to be nice and polished, it needs to be crisp, clean, or it's got to have that beautiful texture to it. Yeah. And, it's quite nice to actually have a little bit more, whether it's a bit more organic, a bit more raw, a bit more used, where necessary, obviously. And, even in exhibitions, it's nice to see things a little bit more simplified. I went to one earlier on in the year, to one of the degree shows, and, it's quite simple, plywood, scaffold poles, quite simple. They've reused it from last year. It's got a bit of honesty to it, and, the students had pinned up quite nicely. Again, some of their models were, made up from bits and pieces that they found, from, the the workshops that they have on the university, or perhaps even some of the construction works that was happening there. So I think it's really nice to sort of see that element. In one of the things that I was thinking about was in terms of translating, say, theory to something quite conceptual, like your exhibition work. Would you say that it's quite straightforward to translate that into, say, something a bit more substantial, like your, apartment design project?
Yes. No, of course. I mean, maybe just on the exhibition design element. So after working on Archi Africa, for example, I was very conscious of, how we produce waste in these temporary exhibition designs. So when I was approached for the islands of the Design Museum, I thought this was a really good opportunity to explore how to design a temporary exhibition that, can be completely circular and considers maybe this notion of temporality within the plinths or the built elements of the scenography itself. So that's why I wanted to use earth. So earth was interesting because earth is effectively a material. In my research on the African compound house, a lot of the houses are built with earth and timber. It's a material that is in a way like really extremely permanent, but also quite temporary, because unless you mix it with cement and lime, well, actually more, if you wanted to make a kind of zero carbon structure, would be to mix it with lime and kind of allow it to dry and then maintain it. It is something that can be destroyed quite easily. But I think that there was a kind of beauty in this. I partly wanted to use earth and like put it in this kind of, not exactly a white cube setting, but the Design Museum is this kind of like pristine, posh setting in West London, to kind of take the stigma out of building with earth. So that's a sort of theoretical concept that I was like, let's like translate that into kind of what does it mean practically. And then beyond that, it's kind of also imbuing the actual experience of going around a temporary exhibition and seeing the material deteriorate over time, not as fast as it would if it was outside in the rain, and the wind, but still, it crumbles and, it sort of, if somebody knocks it, it will eventually kind of crumble down. And if the exhibition was up long enough, it would have eventually, totally deteriorated with enough knocks. So I thought that was kind of a nice statement to make on the waste produced by temporary exhibitions, but also the fact that the earth could return back to earth. It's crushed brick and clay and London clay. It's like it actually got taken back to allotments in Tolworth, where it will eventually kind of deteriorate back into the earth. There's like a full circle moment. The hemp sheet also are biodegradable. So they are degradable, but they will be reused in the meantime before they completely degrade. So I think there was an intent there of doing lots of different things, coming from my kind of compound house research and research on something that is highly stigmatized and how you can use a different setting to destigmatize it. And then also to kind of just bring the public's awareness to material temporariness and permanent and temporary materials, and how to build kind of into public consciousness. And then with the apartments, so for me, the apartments, again, there's a lot of work being done on the destigmatizing, or like kind of just like repositioning how we define luxury, how we define contemporary as well. In Kenya, especially, there's a lot of my research stemmed from this notion that we are directly importing sort of Western state standards and Western concepts to a context that actually is a very different way of living, very different climate, obviously, very different materials there. So how do we really build more contextually, but also value the knowledge and knowledge systems of a place, and not just value the leftover colonial and standards, or value this kind of perceived Western standard that's been sort of propagated by TV and the media. Yeah, there's a lot of good things about the Western side. I live in the West. I'm not saying it's all bad. I just think that it's about a balance and understanding those knowledge systems as equal, and one not better than the other. And that's really part of this kind of decolonial agenda. Decolonization or decolonialism is not necessarily about undoing what colonization did, even though that would be great. But it is about like addressing the legacy of colonialism and just accepting that, okay, Kenya might be an independent country, but a lot of the legacies of colonization still remain today, in terms of land rights, but also in terms of sort of even, I guess, a stigma of like who is, treated in a nicer way because they're white or Asian even, and who is not because they're Black. So all of these things are still sort of really ingrained in the culture and the place. And that's what the project on the 60 apartments in Nyali is trying to address. As well as, for me, the project in Nyali has also really been super fascinating because it's helped me really look at the architectures of Kenya and really understand the kind of how mixed it is. So you have the kind of architecture of trade in the Swahili coast that is really influenced by the Arab world. And that you have the kind of indigenous Bantu architectures. You have the British colonial architecture, but then also the sort of Asian architecture that sort of is intertwined with the British colonial architecture, because Indian Asians came to East Africa. Well, a lot came during the trade routes. Because of the trade routes, kind of that predates the British, but there were also laborers who came with the British. So there's this another layer, and I think it's been really fascinating, sort of understanding how to design a contemporary architecture that really integrates all of these layers and doesn't sort of prioritize one over the other.
Do you think part of the best, not the best route, but part of the most appropriate is maybe the better word, route of designing, and we probably looked at this at university, probably in like the first year or second year, was vernacular architecture, because I find that when we were taught about it, it was quite new at the time, probably, where it's like, why would you pick materials that were local to an area, or why would you design, as you've said quite rightly, to something that would be appropriate to Kenya, to that local area. And I think certainly my perception at the time was, it's got to look fantastic. It's got to look like this. You would very much brainwash to think like a certain architect, or, it's got to look like something that Renzo Piano did, or Foster, or whatever it might be. And I think I certainly feel that there's more willingness, certainly from designers, I think, to approach it in a way that I think is a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more thought through. To do all the things that perhaps we as designers do and should be thinking about, in terms of community, in terms of place, in terms of the history and the culture. But I find that all of these elements can quite practically be taken through to the selection of materials or the form of the building. As you said, by understanding that context, it really can help you design the building, those apartments, perhaps in a different way by, somewhere in London where, you design it completely differently to deal with a different climate scenario. Does that does that form part of, obviously, we all do site analysis, but does that form a big part of what you would do in your approach to design, in your practice, where you will think very much about that context and thinking about, because a lot of things that have happened recently in our industry is thinking about climate resilience, right? So,
Yes.
and I'm certain every time I go back to India, I feel that climate resilience means different things it does say to here in London. And is that something that you've noticed perhaps and that you try and think about?
Yeah, completely. I think one of the things that's really important when we talk about climate change is this notion that like climate has no borders, and we can't like silo it to how we address climate change in London or in the UK will necessarily fix all of the issues globally, and how interconnected our climate is and our world, and actually the effects felt most prominently in the global south are mostly been, it's mostly been affected by how we use energy in the global north. So really this disparity on who is affected versus who is complicit is really needs to be addressed, first of all, but also the way we approach climate needs to be addressed from a more kind of planetary standpoint rather than in the siloed way. You did have a question of like, if money was no object, what is the one thing you would implement to tackle climate change? And I actually found that question really difficult to think about and consider. And I might be jumping the gun, so tell me if maybe I should say.
No, I mean that's what I mean. I was alluding to it. I mean,
yeah.
For me, what your opinion is quite interesting here, because you're not only practicing in London, but you're also practicing abroad. You're teaching, and I think you've got quite an interesting view through research as well, which I think we've said earlier on in the episode that that can really inform, I think, how you think about it. Perhaps if you had asked me that question like 10 years ago, I'd say, oh, let's just get PVs on the roof, or let's just put wind turbines, and that's solves a problem. But I think it is interesting to actually understand the various elements of it, of what climate change is causing us so many problems on so many different aspects of our lives. So yeah, I'm genuinely interested. What would you, if you could, click your fingers, you had that, no issue of money, what would you do?
I first wanted to challenge this idea that it would be solved through money, though, because I don't think tackling climate change should be a costly thing, and I don't think it should be afforded just by the wealthy or the very few, because arguably it's the wealthy and the few who have been the problem so far. But anyway, I think in the first instance, obviously the wealth imbalance does need to be addressed, and I think that, well, I personally do think that decolonization or addressing the history of empire and imbalance of kind of resources and who is allowed to extract certain resources needs to be addressed, and most importantly that the voices in the global south are treated as sort of very equal in the conversation of climate change. I don't think it can be solved only by like America and the UK and the kind of European powers alone. Of course, we need to eliminate our reliance on fossil fuels, and that's like really intangibly coupled with our reliance on concrete and cement, because you need oil to create cement. So I think if we or eliminate our reliance on those two, I think it's going to solve a lot of issues as well as war, hopefully, or a lot of the wars. I think the thing that is expensive is maybe uncovering this like holy grail nuclear fusion reliable energy source that is being done on a kind of mass scale, but we haven't quite cracked yet, which will mean, because we know solar isn't reliable, and the lithium and cobalt needed for the batteries is not any better than extraction of oil and gas. So hydro is good. I mean, having a variety of sources, hydro, geothermal, wind, biomass energy, and solar is a good thing. But yeah, the crux of it, the batteries required for the solar energy isn't great. I do think that in the short term, traditional and vernacular architecture can really help us understand how to, because inherently it was built in a way that balanced the local available materials. It really placed an importance on the maintenance of buildings as well. We need to think much more carefully about what it is that we are building, rather than just kind of putting a building up really quickly and not considering its longevity or its purpose, and having it. Yeah, there was a really great article on if Labour do come into power and we are able to build loads of housing in the UK. Well, if we build the housing with the standards we have currently, I don't think that that's necessarily going to help our housing crisis, because the standards we have for our housing currently aren't amazing. And I think that they can be a better way of doing it. I mean, the main driver. So I'm on the Mayor of London's Architecture and Urbanism framework as part of a consortium with OMX, Adam Nathaniel Firm, and YAA projects. And the main kind of driver for our bid was kind of looking at how can we design housing that suits the lifestyles of the diverse population of London that we have today, but also how do we provide housing that is robust and has good ventilation, has good height standards, space standards, maybe can support a kind of change of lifestyles and is adaptable. So I think all of these things need to be considered much more holistic, rather than, okay, we have a housing crisis, let's just build as many homes as we can really quickly, or we have a climate crisis, let's just say sustainability as many times as we can in a sentence, and that goes away.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's just nuts, isn't it? I mean, the number of meetings that I go to, or talks or whatever it might be, and sustainability just gets banded around, and we all know about the greenwashing sort of term. So yeah, it's really interesting to sort of hear that point, and I'm definitely going to have to get you back on this podcast to have a talk about housing, because that's something that I'm very interested in sort of thinking about. But for everyone listening in, thank you so much for listening in today, and until the next one, I'll see you then.